All right, good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. It is 11 o'clock in Chicago by my watch, so it's time to begin. Thank you for attending this PowerCast, How to Build a Successful IFS Security Strategy by Sandi Moore of Fortra. This PowerCast is sponsored by Fortra. My name is Ian Cartwright, and I'm Education Manager for Common, and if you experience any technical issues during the presentation, go ahead and send me a chat message, and I will address your issue. If you'd like to send Sandy a question about the actual content, for that, you're going to use the Q&A area, and she will answer your questions at the end of the presentation as time permits. As I said, presenting today is Sandi Moore. Sandy's been working with Fortra customers for over 15 years, supporting systems monitoring and security software. Experience on IBM I, AIX, and Linux. She's been involved in product demos, implementation support, training, research, and product testing. She shared her knowledge at multiple user group conferences, including at Common. With that, I'm going to have Sandy take control. Sandy, go ahead.
Thanks, Ian. You can hear me okay?
Can hear you fine.
Awesome. All right. As Ian said, Sandi Moore here. I'm a principal security consultant with Fortra. So today we're going to have a little conversation about security for IBM I, specifically focused on the IFS. Fortra is a new face of help systems, if you haven't come across that piece of news recently. And really our focus is to be your cybersecurity ally and really trying to take that focus down to cybersecurity and making sure that you can cover all of your security needs, not just on IBM I. So if you have other things that come up, please feel free to reach out to us. But really, it's about the IFS security for IBM I today. And you probably wonder, all right, why do we have to talk about a security strategy? IBM has a reputation for being one of the most secure operating systems on the market. And that reputation has held pretty firm over the years. And one of the reasons is that IBM has told us that they have exceptional security. So it's not just the users, it's not just the companies that are using it, it's IBM themselves. But really from my perspective, and I think I share that perspective with many of my colleagues, the system itself is not inherently secure. They've added a lot of great security features to the IBM I, but you have to actually implement those. So we like to actually refer to the system more as securable. There is assembly required. You have to actually take advantage of those tools that are provided to be able to get that system to that secure, more secure state. And you probably wonder, all right, well, how do you know that? Well, here at Fortra, we actually every year we do a state of IBM I security study, and we take this data from our security scan tool and compile the results. So this is not us guessing as to what's happening in the IBM I world. It is actual data from customer systems, and what we're seeing is that year over year, there's still room for improvement. There's still companies that are not taking advantage of the ability to secure their servers better. Very often, this is the core server for the business, and I pause when I think that these are not being secured to the best of your ability. So, with that said, actually, want to actually run a poll question by you guys, really kind of getting an idea for what kind of security projects you guys are working on this year. Obviously, you're here to hear about security, so there's definitely it's on your mind, but kind of to understand really what's the agenda, what are the priorities, whether it's malware and ransomware protection, securing your TCP/IP interfaces, integrating into a SIEM or syslog solution, but also maybe cyber insurance requirements are driving it, or maybe you're not involved or you're not actually focused on that and you're just here because you had an hour to kill. So, a lot of different reasons. Maybe it's multiple reasons here and it's a big project. I've seen that multiple studies that cybersecurity is at the top of everyone's list, that unfortunately this is the world we're living in. All right, Ian, what do we have? Okay, we have a lot of malware ransomware protection, securing your TCP/IP interfaces, cyber insurance requirements coming up, and then some others not sure. Not surprised, this is not always where, it doesn't always trickle down to those of us that are tasked with the day-to-day work on the system until it's time for it to launch. So not unusual. So glad to know this. This kind of helps me to understand where you guys are coming from. So as we go through, we'll be able to have a better perspective. All right. So when we're talking about your IFS security strategy and building up the security on the system, it's really about a lot of work. Unfortunately, security is not there's no silver bullet to make the system more secure, and the systems have been this way for quite some time. And this, some of these servers, I talk with people and they've been, this server's been around for 30 years. So there's been 30 years of work to make the system not great in the security arena. And if someone tells you that there is a shortcut, there's a quick fix, that all you have to do is add this software and it's magically secure, I would be leery of that, because it does take work, and it takes things, multiple things that actually get it to that more secure state. And as the core server for the business, do you want to not take it seriously? And so really addressing it, I think, is going to be beneficial to everyone. All right, so quick circle back, a little bit of a history lesson, just because I think, sometimes people don't realize what the IFS is and how it came about, because it's a little odd. It's kind of the odd man out from a green screen that we typically think of the system as. So the integrated file system was actually added quite some time ago. So in 1994, V3R1, and what it was done to actually allow for the IBMI to integrate with Unix, Windows, and other types of operating systems. And it has a directory structure much like a PC, and providing access to data stored between these servers and an easy way to move it back and forth between these platforms. It does actually have several predefined file systems that are included as well, with root directory being the overarching infrastructure at the very top. And each one of those predefined file systems within the IFS has its own limitations and rules. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, when we look at the integrated file system, there's actually been a long-standing misperception that it was an add-on, that it is an extra, but it does encompass all of the file structures of the system, and even those that predate the IFS. So prior to 1994, you've got QDLS in your system library, your system native objects and libraries, and under QSYS.LIB. So they are all part of the IFS. It's just that this is over the top of it, and it is not a removable part of the system. It is the system. So we have to take it seriously. This is really where the security agenda and the security initiatives that you should be addressing are going to come into play. So let's talk about the risks. Of course, why do we care about it? What can happen? Unfortunately, there are a whole host of risks, and we'll talk about those. Your data is valuable, and whether it's valuable to you, valuable to somebody else, there is, of course, the potential for data theft, and data can be stolen by a threat actor and sold on the dark web, but it can also be an employee who is looking to go somewhere else or has been offered a sweet deal to sell you the information that they have access to. Data ransom, of course, we've heard a lot about that. Where they want your money if you want to have access to your data back, or they're going to threaten to expose it, and the extortion attempts to get money so that they don't release that information that they were able to get a hold of. And of course, there's also destruction. So whether it is a destructive malware that is going to go through and just nuke things, sometimes it's an agenda that just to prove, hey, I can do it. But also it could be accidental data destruction. And that's where we kind of have a tendency to forget about that. It's easy for somebody to make a mistake. You get distracted on a call, you delete something, and unfortunately, now it's gone. So anyone and anything is a target. There is no one industry, one type of business that is going to be a target. If you are a business, you make money, you have data, you're going to be a target. So really, we have to really think about, how do we combat this? How do we ensure that we have added layers of protection so that we don't have the system compromised? The integrated file system at risk, unfortunately, because there is a default access that is equivalent of public all, over the IFS. So when directories are created, they adopt that authority. And so they are going to also have those unfortunate settings. And then we also see that objects are stored on the system that may not be appropriate. And whether it's a PC being backed up, somebody's loading, other random files into their home directory. But this really gives that ability for objects to be stored on the system that really don't have any business need to be on the server. And of course, that public hall authority also allows for damage from malware. And we're definitely going to be talking about that some more. And, when we look at what's at risk on the system, most organizations do, in fact, have confidential information stored in the IFS, and it does need to be protected. So whether or not you immediately recognize this as information that is confidential, if you're not doing inventory of what you have stored on the server, you're not quite sure what's there. Sometimes it's a matter of something being printed from one of your databases out to the stream file in the IFS. And now that data that is confidential to your organization has moved into another format that may not be as well protected. I mentioned malware. So of course, there's always that belief that maybe power systems can't be infected with malware. And it's unfortunately a myth. And it is, in fact, the native side of it is resistant to malware. And I always debate this with people because malware is malicious software. So anybody can write a malicious RPG program to do something. Highly unlikely, it's less likely. What we really think of is that because those programs have to be recompiled, that really we're not going to have that issue of infection in those native programs. That was interpreted to be that there's no virus possible on the IBMI. IBM's never actually claimed that it's immune from viruses. They actually added integrated controls at V5R3. So they recognized that 10 years after they created the IFS that, oops, we potentially have a problem here. So we need to put some controls in place so this can better be handled. Now, me telling you that it's in fact vulnerable to viruses isn't enough. Sometimes it's the pictures. In pictures worth 1,000 words. And having the fact that we have seen multiple customers, I'm not going to venture how many because I kind of lose count, but the fact that we are seeing infections on systems, whether it is Trojan horse programs that have been dropped into QSYS, or someone who has a share over a particular web directory, and they end up with some of the common ransomware gang malware, the black matter, for example, dropped into those directories and used as the launch of a ransomware attack onto these systems. And it hits over and over again. We've seen ransomware hitting power systems where they've got 500,000 files encrypted by ransomware, 248,000 copies of that ransomware dropped onto the server. So self-replicating. But I've also seen development systems where, a week later, somebody realizes, hey, I can't get onto the development system, and they discover they've got 400,000 files encrypted by Niton ransomware. So it happens over and over again, and in any directory is vulnerable. It just depends on how you're using the IFS, how you're securing the IFS to make it to expose it. We've even seen where ransomware attacks have happened, and 5 years down the road, somebody thinks, we should go scan the system because, we did a lot of cleanup in our attack, but 7 years down the road, we find that there is still that ransomware on the system, and those files have been accessed in recent weeks. So having it sitting on the system and being old doesn't mean it's no longer a threat. How does it expose it? There's the IBMI itself can act as a source of outbreaks in the network, whether those users are accessing those files, they don't really pay attention to what they're opening, or they think it's their actual file, or they're being nosy. That virus activity can be propagated through multiple channels. That's the shared IFS directories, huge offender, map drives, even bigger exposure through those IFS shares, but also FTP files can be loaded up to the system and pulled down from the system. NFS mounts, SMB shares as well, backups, right? So you're going to propagate, if you're going to back up a file that's infected onto your backup, you're going to propagate it out to your DR system. High availability is also a really easy way to move malware from one server to another. File gets changed on your production system and it's infected or encrypted by malware. HA system says, oh, there's a change. I'm going to go ahead and replicate that. So it is very easy for it to migrate within the environment. We often, there's layers of antivirus and defenses in place in your environment. Whether, we still see though that with antivirus deployed everywhere within an environment, those viruses can still reach power servers, whether it's a zero-day exploit. And once it's dealt with on the Windows side of the network, for example, if you don't think to go look at the IBMI and the IFS, you don't realize that it actually made its way over to that server as well. Failed signature updates, whether it's at the network level or the PC level, the workstations, when those updates are compromised. But also deactivated or blocked virus engines. It's very often a first step of an attacker is to deactivate the protection. And sometimes users do it too. I've been known to disable my protections. Don't tell my IT people that, but it happens. And you're trying to do something and you keep getting blocked. So I'm just going to disable it. Maybe you don't restart for a while and you don't restart those protections. So it does happen. If all of these layers of protection we have in place worked 100%, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Compromised users, of course, are our biggest problem. And it only takes one user to become the avenue for an attack. It doesn't take everybody. And I like to remind folks of that, is that it's not all of your users. It's just that one who has the access that becomes the victim. Business email compromise is a very common avenue for those threat actors to get credentials to your environment and to be able to get to these servers. In our Fortra, Zagari, and Fish Labs report this year, they talk about the trends, and they're really seeing that malicious emails have increased exponentially, and that 99% of these threats were impersonation threats, like business email compromise, but also credential theft lures. And so once that user has become compromised, if you're not aware of it, how are you going to know you need to stop something? So every layer of security you add is the better. You can also download that report. It's fascinating, but yet terrifying at the same time. But those compromised users, the threat actors do not have their own credentials. They're going to use your users' credentials. So they're going to be the catalyst for these compromises. So we have to take it seriously. All right, so let's talk strategy and what you can do to secure the IFS. Now that I've given you some doom and gloom there, talked about all the things that might go wrong, talking about how you're actually going to make some of this right and be able to create these new controls. Obviously, you have perimeter controls in place. You've got your firewall. I have a lot of conversations that I talk with people start out with, oh, well, the system's behind the firewall. Of course, it's behind the firewall. Everybody has a firewall and your system should be behind it. That's a given, but it's not enough. So you've got workstation controls. Those are important as well, making sure that you are protecting and defending where the user works. But we've also granted users access, and very often that access we've granted them is on their first day of work, and they're given a lot of access to a lot of things on the system. We don't even know them yet. So really, there's additional steps at the server level that we want to take, focus specifically on the IFS. System configuration, this is your foundation. This is the beginning. And if you don't have a solid foundation, you don't have a lot to protect. So really need to ensure that that system configuration is addressed appropriately. First thing, restrict access to QSYS.LIB. And we talked about QSYS.LIB is just another directory under that root directory. Most users have zero need to be able to access that native infrastructure through remote clients. So rather than having the hope that nobody actually will be able to take advantage of it, or relying on that security by obscurity that nobody knows what it is, control access to it. So IBM does provide an authorization list that can restrict the access of QSYS.LIB through those TCP interfaces. So changing the QPWF server authorization list to public exclude will deny access for users to be able to access QSYS.LIB if there is a root share, or if it is through the ACS integrated file system utility. However, to remind you that unfortunately, all object authority will override that authorization list authority. So those users are still going to be a problem, and I'll offer you guys some more solutions on that here in a bit. But this is a good first step, making sure that QSYS.LIB is not accessible. Definitely need to review your IFS shares. So big part of this in knowing and understanding what shares have been created, and eliminate unnecessary shares. If it's a share that was created for a single purpose, but nobody ever went back and cleaned it up, you need to get rid of those. Ensure that you're not sharing the root directory. I actually worked with somebody once who had 2 IFS shares over the root, and they didn't think they had any root shares. And they actually had 2 of them, and they had different names. And so sometimes the names of those shares can be misleading. You don't realize that you've actually shared the entire system. Another tactic is to make those shares read-only wherever you can. If it's read-only, the IBMI is only going to act as the host to the malware and spread it out. It's not going to be spread to the system. So you reduce some of that exposure. And the other last tactic would be to create shares that are not discoverable in the network. So discoverable shares are going to be taken advantage of. Threat actors are often inside of those environments for weeks, sometimes even months, looking for valuable information to attack. So ensuring that those shares are not discoverable to a nosy person is going to go a long way for at least making those shares that you do leave are not vulnerable. Auditing gives you visibility to what's happening on the system. We think of auditing, we think of the database files and auditing the native side of the system, but you should also be auditing activity over the IFS. You know, critical directories in the IFS, you should know who's actually working with those. So first step is to make sure that you have an audit log configured. Make sure that you're auditing the correct type of activity. So if you have to have object auditing turned on so that you can actually start auditing IFS objects. Once you've got that, turn on auditing for the IFS directories and objects that are critical to the business, making sure you understand who is in fact modifying those objects, who is reading those objects. And then establish a policy around collecting that information. How are you going to be using it? Is somebody going to actively review it? And if something really suspicious happens, are you going to be alerting anybody to the fact that this happened? And of course, being able to keep that data long enough from that audit log to make sure that it's helpful. Breaches are often not discovered for, sometimes even 6 months up to a year. And then you need to be able to go back and look to see what happened as that particular threat built up. And this is where you're going to be able to grab that information. So having this and having a plan around how you're going to audit the information, and as well as what you're going to do with the information you've collected. Strengthen your user profile security. This is a big part of it. And we tend to dismiss it because we have all of our network side. And what we really need to be doing is paying attention to the users on the system. This is how the threat actors are going to get to the system. So make sure that you disable or delete unused user profiles. That's an empty chair. There should not be a user profile associated with it. So making sure that those are managed proactively and not once a year. Because any unused profiles can be taken advantage of. You're not paying attention to what that user's doing. You don't expect them to be doing anything. So you just kind of just ignore it. Remove default passwords. This is a dangerous practice, and I do see it quite a bit, unfortunately. But default passwords are low-hanging fruit for a threat actor. User ID and password matches. So you need to be sure that you're cleaning those up as well. Don't set the password on a new user to start default. Just define a corporate default password that is not the same as the username and work from that. Evaluate your user special authorities. Another thing that goes often overlooked is the users that have all those special authorities. There's 8 of them. All object is definitely the biggest one, and we do see it overassigned many, many times. So ensuring that you are aware of who has those authorities. Think of it this way: if those users have these special authorities, they are an administrator. Whether or not their job is to be an administrator, they have administrative rights to the system. And that can very much be problematic when we're looking at any security on the system, not just IFS security. Remove your command line authority. So users that can access the command line can do a lot of damage on a system. There's actually over a dozen native IFS commands. You know, we're focused on IFS security today. There are a lot of native IFS commands. Put this in the back of your heads. If you have a user that has the ability to access a database, they have access to command line, they want to get that data off the system, but they really want to be sneaky about it. I'm going to copy that data into an IFS file, and then I'm going to use that lovely share you created for me, and I'm going to take that data off the system through a stream file onto my PC, onto my thumb drive, and I'm going to go out the door. So having somebody with the ability to do that is not a good plan. So reducing the potential for users to take advantage of that option is going to go a long way. All right, so a lot of things you can do on the system. Let's talk about the virus and ransomware protection, because of course this is a big part of it. And I wish it wasn't, because it's nasty. It's not a fun thing to deal with, but it has to be addressed. I've actually had people tell me, oh, geez, let's not talk about viruses again. You can't ignore it. This is not something that is going away. So using native antivirus is a critical part of this. Of course, I mentioned that that IBM added native support for the system starting at v5r3. So what was added is really integrated into the system. We've got system values that allow to interface with commercial scanning solutions, providing the ability for on-demand scanning through batch jobs, but also on-access scanning on open and close. And so giving you the control over how that's going to behave and what's going to be scanned. Exit point integration was added as well. So the ability to scan files on open as well as an IFS scan on close. So giving that interface to be able to have that program grab the file, scan it, and give the results back to the operating system. And then attributes were added to the IFS objects to make this more streamlined. So the attribute for a directory to create object scanning, and then the stream files themselves, you can track and determine whether or not the object should be scanned, if it should only be scanned, if it's changed recently, or never scan it, which is not a common option, but it could. There's use cases for that too. But also the status of the last time it was scanned. So not only does the operating system know, the software is going to be able to update it. So ensuring that you're doing this natively on the system so that you're not actually creating another exposure. Trying to use non-native solutions, you actually have to share the root directory, undoing some of those controls we already determined needed to be put into place. But it creates a whole other host of issues with data moving across the network that should not be going off the system to a local workstation or a Windows server, but also the bandwidth. And none of that data is encrypted as it's being moved across. So native virus scanning is critical. IBM added the infrastructure to support it because they recognize that this is the best way to manage it. You're going to be able to benefit from that integration between the IBMI and the antivirus engine, using those stream file attributes to streamline and manage those scans more effectively, and then be able to do selective scanning. So if that file hasn't changed recently, we don't need to rescan it. The IBMI itself is able to recognize if there's an infected file. So if it's marked as a scan failure, it's infected, it knows that a user should not be accessing that file so that it will no longer be available and it cannot spread out back into the network again. That real-time scanning, being able to scan as users are accessing the stream files through the highest risk interface, and that's through those map drives, that file server. So being able to scan before the user opens it, or if somebody updates an IFS file through a read-write share, making sure that that update does not contain malware so that they're not spreading infection to the system. And of course, being able to integrate with the job scheduler and actually scan when you want for all of those file systems that you have not shared, because you're not sharing the root directory now. So making sure that you can do that back-end scan, because IFS files are populated through a lot of ways, as I mentioned before. Powertech Antivirus can give you that protection for the system with virus detection and removal. So we're able to detect and remove the malware, scanning on access, scanning on close, doing that on-demand scan as well, ensuring that the system is not harboring malware. Whether you're sharing files out to vendors or if you've got customers uploading files to you, you don't want to be the one spreading malware out to other people, other environments, other servers. So ensuring that you're using that layer of protection to make sure that the system is not part of that outbreak. It's all about the layers. Every layer counts. This is that one last layer at the core server. Of course, ransomware itself is attacking from a PC. It's going to take advantage of users' access to those shared IFS directories. And in those cases, what you're going to find is the files are read, renamed, encrypted, and then deleted. Malware doesn't necessarily drop onto the server during those ransomware attacks. So you may see that happen. And unfortunately, those reads, renames, encrypts, and deletes are normal functions against files. So in order for you to be able to defend against that, you can use our Powertech anti-ransomware protection, where we're able to evaluate the access pattern of those users to be able to determine if that access pattern is a malicious access pattern and then block them so that you're reducing that blast zone. Maybe a couple of files end up being encrypted and damaged, but it's not the entire IFS share that user had access to that is compromised. So ensuring that you stop those attacks quickly. It's all about reacting quickly when we're talking about ransomware. The longer it has to run, the more that's damaged, the more that's potentially exposed. So being able to block that attack and know what's happening early on, it's going to save a lot of heartache. All right, so you've got one tool here that you can use to add to that layer of protection, building on that strategy. Let's talk about exit programs. So another step to be able to add control over how that system's going to be used and how we can reduce the exposure and the risks to the IFS. So a lot of PC interfaces circumvent menu and application security. And this is something where I like to describe it as these are the side doors to your system. Think of the green screen or your application web interface or GUI interface. That's your front door. Those are the places where you've got, you have the receptionist sitting at the door, you've got you have to scan your badge to get in, you've got your credentials, you know that when somebody comes in that door. However, the FTP, file server, DDM, a lot of different interfaces, those are on the periphery. Users still have their access to those services, but you don't have anybody actually watching those doorways to the system. And with that, unfortunately, not being able to see who's using it, it makes the system very vulnerable. So those interfaces bypass the controls you had on your application menus or in your application web interface, and the command line restrictions are not going to apply. And unfortunately, a lot of these interfaces give you access to the IFS. We do often assume that the access to the IFS is just the work link command and it is those shares of the IFS. A lot of people tell me, well, we don't have shares. Well, it's not the only way you can access the IFS. There's a lot of ways. A couple of alternatives for accessing those IFS objects, you can FTP, You know, you have to do a change directory and go to the directory you want. Even with users with limit capabilities, yes, on the native side of it, you can still run FTP commands. Or if you have in ACS, you have that integrated file system option, those users are going to be able to access the system that way. QShell is another way as well. So, or PowerShell. So a lot of different ways you can actually get to the system and have access to those objects, where through that front door of the system, the user would never have it. But because by default at the system level, they have that authority, unfortunately, it can become an avenue for exposure. But also modifying objects. At the base object level, the user may have access to update a file, whether you're putting the file on the system through FTP or selecting files to upload and overwrite what's already there, but also maintaining objects. If that user has that ability, they can rename a file, they can delete a file. And I use maintain loosely. Deleting a file is maintaining it. You've gotten rid of it. So all of these avenues to be able to actually access the objects in the IFS, and because these interfaces don't honor those controls you have, these users have free access to do what they're authorized to do technically at the system level, and you have no visibility to it. That is really where the system fell short in not having the auditability of what's happening. So what you can do is add that layer of control. This is your firewall for the IBMI, where you're actually able to put exit programs in place to ensure that this user really needs to be able to use this doorway to the system, and put that security camera over the door. Put the locks on the door if appropriate, so that they're not able to do whatever they want through these alternate interfaces. Exit programs can do anything. They could even be malicious. But what we would like to see is that exit programs give you two functionalities. One is the ability to audit. So you can actually see who is using it. I mentioned that you should be cleaning up your IFS shares. And if you don't know who's using those shares, how do you know if you can get rid of it or not? You can remove the share and see if anything breaks, the users complain, or you can audit with an exit program and actually see who is accessing the IFS and how are they accessing it and what are they getting to. And then adding control. This is about being able to give, whether it's a pass fail, are we going to let that activity continue? And think of it, this is going to add to your deny by default. Zero trust. This user has no business using this interface, but they need access to another one. So the ability to decide which interface is appropriate for the users, and then be able to allow the unwanted activity to be stopped. So really, it's about covering the most attacked interfaces that really are the most unguarded or least guarded on the system. Most threat actors are not going to go use your green screen connection. They're not going to break into your application interface. They're going to go for the juggler. They're going to use the interface that is the easiest and most common across all operating systems, all platforms, and it's going to be one of those PC interfaces. So Powertech Exit Point Manager provides you with that protection, that layer of control, where you can build up those rules. You don't want to break anything off the top. You want to make sure that you understand what's happening on the system, build out those rules, allow the authorized activity to continue, but then start blocking unauthorized activity, and then ultimately deny by default. If you're not on my approved listed users and approved activities, you're not getting into the server. So ultimate goal there in being able to ensure that those users using that file server are supposed to. And maybe we're going to remove their ability to delete stream files, right? Reduce the damage to the system. Even though technically at the system level, they may have that authority. Take that away through the interface that's least appropriate for them. All right, so final piece of that strategy, multi-factor authentication. And I think this one often goes overlooked. We have multi-factor authentication on very often on your network credentials. So you sign into your PC, you have to open up the app on your phone and approve that you're accessing the server or you're accessing the corporate applications. But what about at the system level, at the server level? Those users are already inside the network, right? So now that user's compromised, they've already authenticated. They're inside. Now we want to make sure that that user accessing one of those interfaces to the system is really who they say they are as well. So taking those credentials that we know and then actually adding a second layer of authentication, whether it's possession of a device or inherits those biometrics, that thumbprint or that face scan, ensuring that that person who has the credentials is really that person and not somebody who's been able to obtain their access. You know, one of the biggest breaches was the SolarWinds breach, and that was actually discovered because one of their administrators had a second cell phone added to their multi-factor authentication. An administrator saw it, thought it was odd because their users only use one authentication device. And that is how it was discovered, was through that two-factor authentication. Obviously, it already had a problem. There was bigger compromise, but it's important to have that additional check, make sure that who's getting on my system really is who they say they are. Powertech multi-factor authentication provides that layer as well. So you've got your user that has their IBMI credentials, something they know, they connect to the system. Powertech multi-factor authentication can divert that to the MFA authentication manager or a Radius server. If you already have authentication in place, we can integrate with a Radius server. Once that happens, check to make sure that user, are they supposed to authenticate? Yes, they are. Authenticate against the device that you've configured, whether it's the biometrics or it's the device, or it can be our desktop application. Once that user is successfully confirmed who they say they are, Powertech MFA is going to allow that user to continue. Gives a signal to the IBMI that says, yep, this user is good. Let's let them on the system. So we know that Joe in accounting who accidentally clicked on that business email compromise and that phishing link and gave his credentials away, he gets that notification that, somebody's trying to authenticate. Wait a minute, that wasn't me. So you're making sure that that person, that administrator who has significant access system is really who they say they are. Very often, this is part of a cyber insurance requirement to be able to do that. Other audit and regulatory compliance mandates will require that as well. So giving you that last piece. So, it's really about order of evaluation. Are they who they say they are? All right, they're in. Now we look at the exit programs. Are they really supposed to be doing this on the server? Yes or no? All right, so we let them in. We're going to let them change files through the file server to the IFS. All right, well, do they have a virus? Because we let them put files on the system with the exit programs. Now we need to make sure that what they're putting on the system or reading from the system is not malware, but also we've authorized them to use the file server. Are we really going to let them do a programmatic read, rename, encrypt, and delete of the files? Nope. All right. Last thing, that foundation, that system configuration. Do we have it set correctly? Are we sharing the right things? Are we ensuring that users don't have too much access to the system? So doing all of those layers can build out a really solid IFS security strategy, ensuring that the overarching infrastructure of the system is not compromised through one of those attack vectors. All right, so I get excited here. I have a call to action for you guys. So when we start talking about that IFS security strategy, take a step back. Consider doing one of our security scans. I mentioned at the beginning, we have our State of IBMI security study we do every year. I'm a geek. I actually love looking at those numbers and looking at really what is happening out there and analyzing that data. And but this is the backbone of that. This is where that data comes from. So the security scan can give you that high level 30,000-foot view of what's happening on the system with security. No obligation. You don't have to buy anything. It's a free tool. Gives you this a very high level look at all of the current security settings on the system that you don't think to review. And every customer that I do a review with, we find something for them to be able to do. Security is never done. And so ensuring that you're looking in all the right places and that you understand what the risk of exposure is so that you know what you need to do and develop a plan and a strategy for how to resolve it. Many customers will come back and do this, once a year and actually, see how much progress they've made on their security projects and their initiatives. So it can be a very helpful for you, but also it drives the data behind our state of IBMI security study. So I encourage you to do this. This is definitely an eye opener and would give you some solid footing for getting support with management to be able to start that security project. All right, quick polling question here. Wondering if you actually wanted to schedule security scan, go ahead and pop that in there if you would be interested in that, if you want more information first before you take that leap of faith there, or maybe you've already done it and it's not something that you want to address. But there's also, maybe you're not ready to look at security on the system. It's just not something you're able to cope with. So I get it, but definitely, something we'd like to do with you to be able to demonstrate not only our expertise and our understanding of security on the system, but give you a strategy going forward. All right, so talked a lot about the tools we have and, the security scan, of course, first step. Adding those layers of protection, system configuration, that's something that maybe you guys don't want to tackle. We have a security services team. They live, eat, and breathe security on IBMI. And so rather than you spending weeks trying to figure out how to do one thing and implement a change, that's something where they can step in and help as well. So just a few of our security products that are available for IBMI, really giving you that holistic approach of addressing specific needs based on what your current security initiatives are. So happy to help, always happy to have conversations with customers to really narrow down and identify where they need to start. And this is definitely something that we enjoy doing. All right, I think we're going to open it up to questions here. See if we've got some questions.
Great. There is a Q&A panel. If you are lost looking at Sandi's PowerPoint deck, you can just hit escape and go back into a frames view for Zoom, and then you should be able to locate the Q&A panel at the bottom nav bar of the Zoom screen. Sandi, there are some questions here. Before I read the first question, there is always questions about the handout and a replay from today's event. Yes, I am recording it. And yes, I have a copy of the presentation slides. It'll be available from tomorrow morning on Commons Learning Management System, and you should get an email once that's available. All right, Sandi, this first question is, if we already have exit program security software, could we still use the one for ransomware?
Absolutely. We encourage customers to layer that protection in place. So it is all about layered security. We do provide in our tools the ability to call supplemental exit programs. So really being able to build out those layers. Each of those tools I talked about already, the multi-factor authentication, the exit point manager, as well as the anti-ransomware, those all use the file server exit points. So we can actually layer those into supplemental exit programs. Even if you're working with another vendor's exit program security, we can assist you with that as well. Not all vendors have actually added that functionality to be able to call supplemental exit programs. So we've addressed that.
All right, there is a question about the names of the products. I think you just went over that, so we can skip that.
Yeah.
I've tried getting rid of my root share, but things break. Any suggestions?
Yeah, so that is definitely a challenge. Root shares are very often been out there for a very long time, and they have built processes around it. So definitely using an exit program to monitor who's using it, how it's being used, what processes, what jobs, where those requests are coming from to start building out a better way to do that. Making it not discoverable. That's one strategy. Maybe identifying and securing that share. So maybe it's not a share for everybody. Change the public authority to the share, and then just authorize those processes that still need access. So it does take a little bit of work, but I think it does a lot for security for the system. I think it's important to have that on high list of priorities.
All right, last chance. Send in your questions using the Q&A panel. It should be on the bottom nav bar of the screen. Where can I find the latest version of Powertech Antivirus?
Absolutely. Yeah, so that is available on our website. If you are a current customer, you can log into the community portal and you'll find it under the download section. So there is a video out there as well as to configuring that anti-ransomware functionality. So I encourage customers to review that too. And it's documented in the user guide.
All right, folks, last chance to send in your questions. While we're waiting for any last minute questions to come in, I will say again that the replay from today and the handout will be available in the Common Learning Management System by the morning at the latest, and you'll get an email when that's available. Not seeing any further questions, Sandy, why don't we go ahead and end a couple minutes early? Thank you a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for a good presentation.
Thank you.
All right, everybody have a good day.